It was a quiet morning when Sandra Bullock pulled into the small local gas station. The air was fresh and the sun was still rising, casting a soft golden light across the open space. Sandra had been on the road for a while, traveling for work, and this gas station seemed like the perfect place to stop and recharge. It wasn't busy, and there were only a few cars around, so she thought it would be a peaceful break from the chaos of her life in the spotlight. Sandra was dressed simply, in a hoodie and jeans, hoping to blend in like any other person on the street. She didn't want any attention. She just wanted to fill up her tank and be on her way. The simplicity of the moment felt almost comforting. She was used to people recognizing her wherever she went, but today she hoped for a bit of normalcy. As she stepped out of the car and started walking toward the pump, she noticed the hum of motorcycle engines in the distance. The sound grew louder, and soon a group of bikers pulled into the gas station, revving their engines as they made their way to the pumps. The noise was jarring, breaking the quiet calm of the morning. Sandra paused for a moment, noticing the group. They were loud, and their bikes had the kind of powerful roar that always made heads turn. At first, she thought little of it. After all, people came and went all the time. But then, as they parked their bikes and started to take off their helmets, Sandra realized something wasn't quite right. The group was staring in her direction, and their eyes didn't seem to have the polite curiosity of people who simply recognized her. No, there was something else there, something that made Sandra feel uncomfortable. She tried to ignore the situation, walking over to the gas pump and focusing on the task at hand, but she couldn't help but notice that the bikers weren't moving on. Instead, they stood in a circle, chatting among themselves, but stealing glances at her every now and then. The energy was shifting, and Sandra could feel it. She was starting to feel out of place, the way you do when you realize you're being watched, but can't quite figure out why. The bikers were no longer just standing there. One of them, a tall man with a thick beard, made his way over to her. He didn't speak right away, but Sandra could sense his approach, feel his eyes on her. She gave him a polite smile, hoping to put him at ease, but he didn't seem to acknowledge it. Instead, he just stood there, sizing her up, and the others started to gather around, too. Sandra's heart started to race just a little faster. She told herself to stay calm, but something about the way they were looking at her made her uneasy. She had faced moments like this before, where people were more interested in her as a famous person than as a human being. But this felt different. The bikers didn't seem to care about her fame. They seemed to be more focused on something else entirely. Feeling uncomfortable, but not wanting to make a scene, Sandra turned back to the gas pump, hoping that they would lose interest and go on their way. But the tension in the air was palpable. There was a strange feeling rising inside her, the kind of feeling that told you that something wasn't right. She could only hope that they would leave her alone, and that the morning would return to its peaceful silence. Sandra had hoped for a peaceful stop, but it seemed the bikers weren't about to let her enjoy it. As she finished filling her car with gas, she couldn't help but notice the group of men moving closer. Their voices were loud and animated, and their laughter carried through the air, cutting through the otherwise quiet morning. Sandra tried to focus on her task, keeping her head down, but she could feel their attention on her. It was impossible to ignore. One of the bikers, a man with a leather jacket and dark sunglasses, made his way toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. Sandra stiffened, glancing at him out of the corner of her eye. He didn't seem to be in a hurry. Instead, he took his time, making sure to walk in a way that made it clear he was aware of her presence. "Hey, you're Sandra Bullock, right?" the man asked, his voice loud enough for the others to hear. Sandra wasn't surprised that he recognized her. It was something she had grown used to, even in the most unexpected places. But the way he asked the question made her feel like he was more interested in something else. The way he looked at her wasn't friendly or respectful. It felt like he was studying her, sizing her up in a way that made her skin crawl. She gave him a polite smile, hoping that would end the conversation. "Yes, that's me," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just filling up the car. I'm not really in the mood for much company right now, though." Instead of backing off, the man leaned closer, ignoring her attempt to set boundaries. "You don't look like someone who likes to be alone," he said, his words dripping with a tone that Sandra couldn't quite place. It wasn't kind, and it wasn't playful. It was something else entirely. The other bikers were slowly closing in, surrounding her in a way that made her feel trapped. They weren't speaking directly to her, but their presence made it clear they were part of the same energy. Sandra felt her discomfort growing, and she couldn't help but wonder how long it would take before they lost interest and moved on. In an attempt to regain control of the situation, she turned to finish pumping the gas and focus on her car. But just as she did, she heard another voice behind her. "Hey, aren't you a little too good for a place like this?" Another biker said, his words laced with a mocking tone. Sandra's grip on the nozzle tightened, but she didn't respond. She could feel the pressure building, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep it together. The bikers weren't backing off. They seemed to be enjoying themselves, their words becoming more casual as they poked fun at her. It wasn't an all-out confrontation, but it was enough to make Sandra feel out of place, more like a target than a person. She couldn't understand why they weren't just leaving her alone. Sandra glanced around, hoping someone might notice what was happening, but the gas station seemed strangely empty aside from the bikers and herself. There was no one to help her, and she didn't know what to do. The situation felt like it was getting out of hand, but she didn't want to make a scene. She just needed them to leave her alone. As the tension in the air grew thicker, Sandra found herself feeling increasingly trapped. She tried to maintain her composure, hoping that the bikers would eventually lose interest and move on. But their presence felt suffocating, like they were surrounding her on all sides, watching her every move. The situation was becoming more uncomfortable by the second, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease creeping up her spine. Out of the corner of her eye, Sandra noticed a man standing near the entrance of the gas station. He was tall, with a calm and composed presence that seemed to contrast sharply with the rowdy bikers. He was alone, and at first, Sandra wasn't sure if he had noticed what was going on. He stood there casually, observing the scene but not making any moves. His demeanor was quiet, but there was something about him that felt reassuring. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was a sense of calm about him that seemed to promise she wasn't alone. The man, with his unassuming posture, continued to watch from a distance. Sandra had no idea who he was, but there was something familiar about him. His face, though not immediately recognizable, felt like something she had seen before. She told herself it was probably just her imagination, but a strange sense of relief washed over her as she realized that someone had noticed the situation. Perhaps this stranger would step in and help if things escalated further. The bikers, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to the presence of the man. They were still laughing and making comments, continuing to inch closer to Sandra, with no regard for her discomfort. One of them was now standing right behind her, and she could feel the pressure building. It was as though their attention was growing more intense, and the once peaceful morning was slipping away. Sandra's mind raced, considering her options. She could try to ignore them and leave, but with the group surrounding her, it seemed impossible. She could also try to speak up, but she wasn't sure if it would make the situation worse. Every instinct in her body told her that something wasn't right, and she needed to get out of there before things took a turn for the worse. Just as the atmosphere seemed to reach its breaking point, the man near the entrance took a step forward. Sandra's heart skipped a beat as she realized that he was walking directly toward her, his movements calm and purposeful. He didn't look like someone who was rushing into a confrontation, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made her feel a little safer. It was as if he was stepping into the chaos with the quiet confidence of someone who had been through far worse and knew exactly what to do. As the man approached, Sandra couldn't help but notice his eyes. There was a familiarity there, something that made her pause. It took her a moment, but then it hit her. She recognized him. This was Keanu Reeves, the actor she had worked with years ago on a film set. Her breath caught in her throat, not because of his fame, but because of the calm and steady aura he carried. He didn't seem fazed by the bikers or the situation at hand. It was as if he had seen this kind of thing before, and he wasn't afraid to step in. Sandra felt a rush of relief. She wasn't sure what Keanu would do, but the simple fact that he had noticed and was now walking toward her gave her a sense of hope. She couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. Sandra's heart was pounding in her chest as she watched Keanu walk closer. His calm, measured steps seemed to cut through the tension that had been building in the air for what felt like an eternity. As he moved forward, the bikers, who had been getting bolder and more vocal, seemed to notice him for the first time. They stopped talking and turned their heads toward him, their eyes narrowing in curiosity. Sandra couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. Keanu wasn't rushing or acting impulsively. He was steady, as if he knew exactly how to handle the situation. There was no hint of panic in his movements, just an air of confidence that seemed to calm the storm around them. The bikers were clearly taken aback by his presence. Some of them exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unsure of what to make of the situation. They had been so focused on Sandra that they hadn't even noticed the quiet man observing them from the distance. One of the bikers, the man who had been the most vocal, stepped forward and smirked at Keanu. "What's your problem, man?" he asked, trying to sound tough, but his voice lacked the usual conviction. It was clear that the calmness Keanu exuded had thrown him off balance. The group had been acting like they were in control of the situation, but now they were starting to doubt themselves. Keanu didn't answer right away. He simply took another step forward, his presence alone enough to send a quiet message. Sandra noticed how the other bikers started to look at each other, unsure if they should back down or stand their ground. It was as though Keanu's calmness had disarmed them, forcing them to reconsider their actions. Sandra wasn't sure if the bikers even realized what was happening, but she could sense the shift. The energy in the air was changing, and it was all thanks to the man who had quietly but powerfully entered the scene. The biker who had spoken first took a step back, his tough demeanor fading as he looked around at his friends. For a moment, there was silence, and Sandra could feel the tension begin to dissipate. The loud engines of the motorcycles, the harsh words, and the uncomfortable atmosphere all seemed to be fading away, replaced by something more controlled. The bikers had started to lose their bravado, realizing that the situation wasn't as easy to dominate as they had initially thought. Keanu finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. "She doesn't want any trouble," he said, looking directly at the group of bikers. "And neither do you." His words weren't a threat. They were a simple, firm statement. He wasn't trying to intimidate them, but he made it clear that their behavior wasn't welcome. For a moment, the bikers stood still, taking in Keanu's words. They weren't used to someone standing up to them with such quiet authority. It was clear that they hadn't expected anyone, let alone Keanu Reeves, to intervene in the way he had. Sandra could see the hesitation in their eyes now, as if they were starting to realize they had pushed too far. The atmosphere had shifted completely. The bikers, who had once been loud and aggressive, were now quietly backing off. One by one, they started to move toward their motorcycles, muttering among themselves. The tension that had filled the air just moments ago was starting to dissolve, and Sandra felt herself breathing a little easier. She didn't know exactly what Keanu had said to them or how he had done it, but she was incredibly grateful. She could feel the weight of the situation lifting, and with every step the bikers took away from her, she could sense the danger fading. She could finally relax, knowing that she was no longer trapped in the uncomfortable, suffocating circle that had surrounded her moments before. Sandra looked at Keanu, and he gave her a small, reassuring nod, acknowledging her without needing to say anything more. It was enough. In that moment, Sandra realized how much she had needed someone to step in and take control of the situation, and Keanu, in his quiet and unassuming way, had done just that. As the last of the bikers slowly walked toward their motorcycles, Sandra felt a wave of relief wash over her. The air, which had been thick with tension just moments before, now felt lighter. She could hardly believe what had just happened, how the situation had gone from intimidating to completely diffused, all because of one calm, quiet man. Sandra turned toward Keanu, who was standing a few feet away, watching the bikers with a steady, almost unbothered gaze. He hadn't raised his voice or used any aggressive force. Instead, his presence alone had been enough to change the entire dynamic. It was as if he had the power to shift the mood of the entire space without uttering a single threatening word. She felt a sense of gratitude flood over her. In a world where chaos and attention often followed her, it was rare to find someone who could provide calm without fanfare. She took a step toward him, still processing everything. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Keanu simply gave her a small, reassuring smile. "No problem," he replied in his usual, humble tone. "I've seen situations like this before. Sometimes, people just need a reminder to step back." His voice was calm and steady, just like his demeanor. There was no boastfulness in his words, just a quiet confidence that made Sandra feel more at ease. Sandra looked around the gas station, now feeling the weight of the moment slowly lifting. The bikers were already starting their engines, their earlier bravado replaced with awkward silence as they prepared to leave. A few of them threw glances over their shoulders at Keanu, but none of them dared to approach him. It seemed that the quiet intervention had been enough to remind them of their boundaries. They were leaving, and Sandra was finally able to breathe without the looming feeling of being watched. Keanu didn't move right away. Instead, he stood there for a few more moments, watching as the bikers drove off, their motorcycles roaring to life one by one. Sandra noticed how calm he remained, as though he had expected nothing less. Once the last of the bikes disappeared into the distance, he turned back toward Sandra, his eyes soft, but with a hint of something protective in them. "I'm glad it worked out," he said, his voice still low and easygoing. "People don't always realize how quickly things can escalate, but it's nice to see when they back down without too much drama." Sandra smiled, feeling a genuine sense of appreciation for him. "I can't believe how easy it was for you to get them to leave," she said. "It's like you didn't even need to do anything." Keanu shrugged lightly, a modest gesture that fit his personality perfectly. "Sometimes you just have to show you're not afraid. People react to strength, even if it's quiet." Sandra nodded, taking in his words. It was true. She had seen firsthand how often people took advantage of others when they sensed fear or hesitation. But Keanu had acted with a kind of quiet strength, something that commanded respect without requiring confrontation. It was a lesson in itself, and Sandra couldn't help but feel grateful for the experience. As she glanced at the gas pump, she realized she still hadn't finished filling up her car. It seemed like the simplest task in the world now, but it had become a strange moment of reflection. She was grateful for Keanu's intervention, but she also realized that for once, she had learned something about herself too. She had learned the power of staying calm in the face of discomfort, of choosing not to react immediately to others' actions. Sandra turned back to Keanu. "I guess I'll finish up here now," she said with a smile. "Thanks again. Really." Keanu smiled back, nodding as he walked toward his car. "Anytime," he said, his tone light and friendly. "Take care." Sandra watched as he drove off, his car pulling away quietly. For the first time that morning, she felt completely at ease. The chaos was gone, and the world felt a little bit safer, all because one man had decided to step in and show that there was another way to handle the situation. As Sandra watched Keanu's car disappear down the road, she felt a deep sense of relief that she hadn't expected to feel so strongly. The quiet that had followed the departure of the bikers was a welcome contrast to the unease that had settled in her chest earlier. Her hands, still gripping the gas nozzle, began to relax, and she allowed herself a deep breath. The morning, which had begun with a sense of calm, had taken an unexpected turn, but now it was finally returning to normal. For a moment, Sandra stood there, gazing at the empty space where the bikers' motorcycles had once been. She was trying to process what had happened, to make sense of how quickly things had escalated and how, just as quickly, they had been diffused. It wasn't often that she found herself in situations like this, where someone's intervention had made all the difference. And yet, it was hard to shake the feeling that something more significant had just unfolded in that brief exchange. She turned back to her car and finished pumping the gas, her mind still on the encounter. Sandra had been in the public eye for so long that she was no stranger to unwanted attention, but this had felt different. The bikers hadn't recognized her as an actress. They had simply seen a woman they could harass, and in a way that felt worse. Yet, in that moment, when things had seemed their most uncertain, someone had stepped in. Keanu had not only recognized the potential danger, but he had handled it in such a way that it didn't feel like an act of confrontation, but one of quiet protection. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about doing the right thing. As Sandra finished securing the gas cap, she couldn't help but think about the way Keanu had carried himself. He hadn't tried to impress anyone or make a scene. His presence had been a reminder of how simple acts of kindness could shift the course of events. There had been no need for harsh words or grand gestures, just a calm, firm stand that had made the bikers rethink their actions. Sandra realized that it wasn't just Keanu's physical presence that had made the difference. It was his ability to stay grounded, to remain unaffected by the chaos around him, that had been so powerful. For the first time in a while, Sandra felt a sense of pride in her own ability to handle the situation. She had stayed calm, kept her distance, and waited for the right moment. But more importantly, she had allowed someone else to step in when it was needed. The power of allowing help when it was offered, rather than trying to do everything herself, had been a lesson that she would carry with her. With the gas tank filled and the situation resolved, Sandra got into her car and started the engine. As she drove away from the gas station, she couldn't help but glance at the road behind her, where the bikers had once been. Everything was quiet now. The storm had passed, and the world seemed to return to its normal rhythm. Sandra smiled to herself, feeling a quiet gratitude for the unexpected turn of events that had brought her peace when she least expected it. And as she drove on, she couldn't help but feel a small, warm sense of appreciation for the stranger who had been in the right place at the right time, quietly watching over her. She didn't know what he had been thinking during those few moments, but the calm assurance he had shown made her feel safer than she had in a long time. As Sandra continued driving, the events at the gas station played over in her mind. The discomfort she'd felt earlier seemed so far away now, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude. She hadn't expected something as simple as a stop for gas to turn into a moment of reflection, but it had. It had been a reminder that even in the most unexpected of situations, there was still kindness and decency to be found. As she drove down the road, her thoughts naturally drifted back to Keanu. She had worked with him in the past and knew him to be kind, but today she had seen a side of him she hadn't fully appreciated before. The way he had stepped in without hesitation, his calm presence cutting through the tension, had been remarkable. There was no fanfare, no dramatic gestures, just an unspoken understanding that sometimes simply being there was enough to make all the difference. Sandra realized that in a world where everything could feel so chaotic, there was something incredibly grounding about Keanu's actions. He hadn't been interested in making a spectacle of himself, and yet, without trying, he had made the situation better. The bikers had left, and she had been spared from further discomfort. But it wasn't just because of Keanu's intervention. It was because he had acted with quiet confidence, showing respect not only to her but to the situation itself. It struck Sandra that there was something almost rare about that kind of approach. In her world, everything seemed loud and fast-paced. People were constantly trying to get ahead, to prove something, to get noticed. But Keanu had done the opposite. He had stepped in, not to claim any spotlight or attention, but simply because he saw someone in need. He didn't need to be thanked. He didn't expect recognition. And that was exactly what had made his actions so meaningful. As Sandra thought more about it, she couldn't help but reflect on the role of kindness in everyday life. It was so easy to forget that small, simple actions could make a big difference. Too often, people were consumed by their own lives, too busy to notice when someone else was struggling. But Keanu had shown her that being present, being aware, and being kind didn't have to be complicated. It was about showing up when it mattered. Sandra smiled to herself, feeling the weight of the experience settle into her heart. She was no stranger to the pressures of fame and public life, but moments like this reminded her of the importance of human connection, of understanding, and of the quiet strength that could be found in the simplest acts. As she turned onto a familiar road, the houses and trees passing by her window, Sandra felt a shift inside herself. The world hadn't changed, but she had. She felt more connected to the people around her, more aware of the small moments that could make all the difference. And she promised herself that, no matter how busy life got, she would always try to be as present and kind as Keanu had been in that moment. With the day unfolding in front of her, Sandra felt a renewed sense of calm and clarity. The world was full of unpredictable moments, but as long as there were people like Keanu around, she knew that even in the chaos, there was always room for quiet, thoughtful kindness. And that, she realized, was something worth holding on to. As Sandra continued driving down the road, she could feel the calm of the morning beginning to settle back in. The noise of the gas station and the bikers seemed like a distant memory, and she was grateful for the peace that had returned to her day. She thought about how unpredictable life could be, how one moment could bring so much stress, and the next, it could turn into something unexpected and meaningful. The sun was now higher in the sky, casting a warm light over everything. It felt like a new beginning, like the world had offered her a brief but valuable reminder of the goodness that still existed in it. Sandra reflected on how often people focused on the negative, how easily the loud, brash moments seemed to drown out the quieter, more meaningful ones. But in the midst of that chaos, Keanu's calm had made all the difference. She couldn't help but feel thankful for his intervention. It wasn't just about him stepping in and diffusing the situation. It was about how he had done it with such grace. He hadn't tried to be a hero. He hadn't sought any recognition or applause. He had simply seen a moment of discomfort and acted quietly and confidently to restore peace. There was something profoundly humbling about that, and it reminded Sandra of the power of small actions. Sandra glanced out the window, the passing landscape offering her a quiet backdrop for her thoughts. The world outside seemed peaceful, almost serene, a stark contrast to the sudden burst of energy of the gas station. She smiled to herself, realizing how often she had taken those moments of peace for granted. Life was busy. There were always deadlines to meet, people to please, and projects to complete. But sometimes, it took a simple, unexpected event like this to remind her of what really mattered. Kindness, understanding, and the ability to show up for each other in meaningful ways. She couldn't help but think about how much people could change if they just took a moment to step outside themselves. If they looked around and recognized when someone was in need, when a small gesture could make a world of difference. Sandra had lived a life under a spotlight, always aware that people were watching her, judging her every move. But today, it wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about connection. It was about understanding that everyone, no matter who they were or where they came from, had a role to play in making the world a little bit better. As she turned onto a quieter road, her thoughts drifted back to Keanu. He hadn't said much during their brief exchange, but his actions spoke louder than words ever could. In a world filled with noise and distractions, Keanu had reminded her of the power of stillness and presence. He had been there when it mattered, and his calm strength had provided her with something she didn't even realize she needed: reassurance. By the time she arrived at her next destination, Sandra felt a sense of peace she hadn't expected. The events of the morning had reminded her that there was goodness in the world, even in the most unlikely places. She knew she would carry that feeling with her, especially when things felt overwhelming. Life could be unpredictable, but as long as there were people like Keanu around, quiet, strong, and kind, there was always hope for moments of calm in the chaos. With a smile on her face and a heart full of gratitude, Sandra stepped out of the car, ready to face whatever the rest of the day would bring. She felt stronger, more grounded, and perhaps a little more aware of the impact small acts of kindness could have on the world. And in that moment, she knew that this was one of those moments she would carry with her for a long time.